Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Friday, March 8th. Today is the 154th day since the October 7th attacks on South Israel. I have some updates from various different news sources, and I wanted to talk a little bit about President Biden's State of the Union address that was given in Washington, D.C. last night. I've been giving these video updates every day since October 7th. If you're interested in our positions at Churches for Middle East Peace, please go to that website. Much of the language I use in these videos comes directly from different news sources. So when I say things like the Israel-Hamas war, it is not because it's Churches for Middle East Peace's position that this is a war. It's because that's what the world is calling it. We actually are identifying what's happening in Gaza as an ethnic cleansing. We've identified what's happened. Many of our groups are very clearly using the word genocide, and all 35 of our denominations have to agree on our terminology for us to be able to use that language. And they all agree that we should highlight that Palestinians have been saying what's been happening on the ground is a genocide. And not only that, the International Court of Justice has said this very well could be a genocide. And we are committed to the prevention of genocide and massive killings and death. The bread massacre I talked about that happened last Thursday, very clearly there are gross human rights violations. And our primary priority is the prevention of further death. Further deaths of Palestinians, civilians in Gaza, further deaths, of Israelis. We condemn the horrific attacks of October 7th. So in case that's helpful context, in terms of Biden's State of the Union, in the hours before his speech, pro-Palestinian protests were held across the United States. In Washington, D.C., demonstrators blocked Biden's road access from the White House to the Capitol. In fact, some of those protesters were members of Churches for Middle East Peace's member communions. Standing on Pennsylvania Avenue between 3rd and 4th Street, the protesters wearing matching shirts. Some of them said, end the war on Gaza. Some of them said Biden's legacy equals genocide, unfurling banners urging the United States to end funding to Israel and to stop arming Israel. One of the things I saw in a video that was so powerful as the street was blocked was that the entire length of the street was full of the names of people who have been killed, the more than 30,000 people that have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. Biden was delayed. This was not written in the news, but I live right here on Capitol Hill. He was delayed 17 minutes. And it was not stated in the news that that was because of the protesters, but I know that that's what happened. Blocking the road, calling for a ceasefire and an end to the war in Gaza. And honestly, as I watched, him enter the room, and as I watched the State of the Union, if you didn't know what was happening in the world, if you didn't know that protest had happened, if you didn't know about the protesters in other parts of the country, if you didn't know what was happening in the world, let alone in Gaza, let alone the families in Israel, begging, doing whatever they can for their loved ones that are still being held hostage to be brought home, hearing the cheers that he was greeted by, you would think that he was going out for a picnic, that he was not a president with the nickname Genocide Joe. The obliviousness, the audacity, personally, even if you disagree on politics, or I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat, the lack of public acknowledgement to me is just utterly appalling. Biden and our government are not only complicit, they, and by default, we are funding and weaponizing a slaughter of innocent people. And then acting like it's not even happening, calling it a humanitarian crisis. Isn't that a nice term? It's just a humanitarian crisis, and we're feeding starving children by building a port. Isn't that great news to prevent it? It just, it's so appalling. It's like putting lipstick on a pig. That's what it is. It's putting lipstick on a pig. Elsewhere, protesters blocked traffic in Boston, in Los Angeles. There were over 50 arrests made in Boston, according to one activist group and the local media. The executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights said, "We're here today because enough is enough," as dozens gathered near the White House, prompting the police to block off a nearby road. The Council on American Islamic Relations advocacy group said that the speech was Biden's best and perhaps last chance to announce steps to reduce Palestinian suffering in Gaza and to win back support of the Arab, Palestinian, and anti-war Americans disappointed with this policy. Some news outlets summarized some of the key points of the State of the Union as it related to everything that's happening in Israel and Gaza. They said that Biden announced plans for the U.S. military to establish a temporary pier on the coast of Gaza, a port, an effort that the administration claims should significantly boost the flow of aid into the besieged territory. What's interesting about this is they said without putting boots on the ground. So the big question is, will American forces have their feet on the ground in Gaza? And thus far, they have said they will not need to. They will do it without putting their feet on the ground. But at the same time, he said Israel must do its part to alleviate the suffering, even as the IDF seeks to eliminate Hamas. And, critics are just saying, this is such hypocrisy, right? You need to do your part while you're bombing all these civilians. You need to do your part while you've cut off water, gas, electricity. You need to do your part while you're enforcing this blockade. You need to do your part while you're maintaining this military occupation. And so these are the contradictions that myself and others are just so frustrated about. For the leadership of Israel, Biden said humanitarian assistance cannot be a secondary consideration or a bargaining chip. Protecting and saving innocent lives has to be a priority. The unveiling of the plan was perhaps the most substantive element of his address that touched on the war. It allowed Biden to demonstrate that he's taking action in the face of anger and defiance from some Democrats over his strong support for Israel, even as Palestinian death tolls mount. The other thing that's so significant that I think has many, many people in Washington, D.C., including the Biden administration internally being quite divided and even split, is that we are consistently hearing the minimization in the administration, in the American government, and perhaps even in the news. We're hearing the vast majority of Americans support a comprehensive ceasefire. We're hearing the vast majority of American Christians support a comprehensive ceasefire, but you don't see that reflected in the administration, you don't see that reflected in the government, and you don't see that reflected in the news. And that is disconcerting, particularly if we're a democracy. The last thing I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is Christianity Today, a flagship periodical. I have written for them on the occasion. I've been quoted by them historically. My dissertation was about them and how they have written about the issues related to Israel, American Protestant engagement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My background, and I'm ordained as an evangelical. I maintain many conservative theological. That's my placement in terms of my own personal theological beliefs. I lead a broadly ecumenical organization, but Christianity Today, after October 7th, the general editor, Russell Moore, came out with an article that said Americans should stand with Israel under attack. And honestly, I was appalled. He warned that both sidism about Hamas is a moral failure, and he stood with a number of other very conservative evangelical leaders. And I wrote an op-ed that was published in Religious News Services that was called "In the Middle East, Evangelical Leaders Need to Stand with People, Not States." And I just wanted to read a little bit of that because I wanted to respond to an article that came out this past week in Christianity Today that's like another round of the same argument. So early in October, this article, by Russell Moore came out. My op-ed's response, evangelical leaders need to stand with people, not states, from Religious News Services. I wrote, Christians should stand with people, not states. We should stand with Israelis, with Palestinians. Thousands of innocent people have experienced utter devastation in the past several days due to the brutal and horrific attacks of Hamas, rockets from Gaza, bombs from Israel, and the armed conflict on the ground. Civilians always pay the highest cost for war, and today God would not support the bombing of Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza that killed hundreds of people. The grotesque reality of the massacres of Hamas in southern Israel should be unequivocally condemned, and the stories of slaughter, rape, and torture constitute crimes against humanity. No excuses, no justification. And now, more than 2 million people living in Gaza, more than half of them under the age of 18, are under a catastrophic siege by the state of Israel. As Biden stated clearly this weekend, the vast majority of Palestinians do not support Hamas and are innocent civilians who deserve to be protected. If there are truly both sides to this conflict, it should be those who are considered those who are for peace and those who are not. I won't read the whole article, but I was appalled that Christianity Today would call Christians to support Jews over Palestinians, to support Israel, to support a state over people. I mean, this is not the Jesus of the Bible. Jesus was always supporting the least of these. Jesus was supporting the woman that was being stoned. Jesus was supporting the Samaritan. Jesus was supporting the lowly over the authoritarians. I mean, who is the Jesus that Christianity Today is talking about? Jesus on the cross forgave the murderers. I mean, Jesus would forgive Hamas. That's what that's saying to me. He forgave the person convicted of murder. Like who is the Jesus that Christianity Today is talking about? What Jesus does Christianity Today know? So another article came out, and forgive me because it's been an insane week, and I wrote down the notes, but the article, I could go into great detail. The article is talking about the horrors of October 7th, as it should, but one of the main, and I didn't even write down in my notes the title of the article. And so, we can find that. We can put it, you will be able to find it. If I look for it, I'll get distracted and it will take way too long. I started to look for it and I lost my notes. But in this article, it talks about Munter Itzhak's Christmas sermon and about comparing Jesus, if Jesus were here today, he would be in the rubble. And it talks about that. And it says this in this paragraph. So this is Christianity Today. The author is someone who writes for them regularly. And it says this is the Christianity Today article, but to wrap him, Jesus, in a keffiyeh, that's the traditional Palestinian scarf. To wrap him in a keffiyeh goes beyond an effort in solidarity, embracing not just partisanship or nationalism, but a symbol of violence that expressly sees the destruction of Jewish life as a key to history. It is a symbol of a movement that glorifies as martyrs those who strap bombs to their chest and blows up school buses. It is not a profound expression of identification or solidarity. It is an obscenity. Now, that's just one paragraph, and really we should talk about the whole article. And there are parts of the article I fundamentally agree with. We should stand against, the historic anti-Semitism of Christians blaming Jews for Christ's crucifixion. Fundamentally agree. We should stand against contemporary anti-Semitism that has risen since, Israel began its campaign against Hamas. I fundamentally agree. The way that this author talks about Palestinians is so appalling. I don't even have words for it. And his ignorance of Palestinian history and culture is just abhorrent. And, he's talking here about suicide bombs during the Second Intifada, which fundamentally should be condemned. I agree with that. But his conflation of any type of Palestinian identity with terrorism is so ignorant and so damaging. I just want to say, shame on you. Shame on you. So this article, it deserves a thorough response. It would take too long in this context. You've heard me say, and I've witnessed the private videos of the October 7th attacks. They are a crime against humanity. It was a massacre on October 7th. And I stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters in not only the condemnation of that day and that abhorrent reality, and the idea that any human being could commit those atrocities to one another grieves me greatly. And we need to stand against those horrors. And I'm committed, as I said, to standing against anti-Semitism, around the world. And I'm committed to bringing the hostages home. And acts of terror, regardless of who they're against or who they're committed by, must be condemned, and we have to work to prevent them. But we don't work to prevent them by perpetrating further violence, which is what's happening right now. We're saying this is a horror, and that is a horror, but we're using that to justify the further perpetration of violence, and that is not okay. And the author here neglects to understand the significance of the keffiyeh. So if you'll just give me a minute, I'm sure this is like way too long, but Palestinian society, the keffiyeh is so significant. It's been worn, historically by Bedouins, long before it was a political symbol. It was used for protection from wind, sand, and other elements. It did not become a political symbol until the 1930s. When Palestinians were indigenous in the land, there was significant immigration, and Palestinians start to develop a unified national identity long before Yasser Arafat. The NPR says that some of the patterns on the keffiyeh symbolize different aspects of Palestinian life. The bold and black stripes on the edges symbolize the historic trade routes that used to go through Palestine. The fishnet-like design represents the Palestinian ties to the Mediterranean Sea. The curvy lines resemble olive trees, a major point of pride for Palestinians. And NPR went on to talk about how the keffiyeh has been used historically in some groups to represent the right of Palestinians to resist violently, which, according to international law, people who are held under military occupation have the right to resist violently against the military occupying power. Now, I personally don't believe, I lead a nonviolent peace building organization, but I think it's important to understand the larger context. NPR says the meaning of the keffiyeh depends on who you ask. And for many Palestinians, it symbolizes their yearning for freedom, and it serves as a nod to their history. For some non-Palestinians, it's a show of solidarity. Last week, I met a woman who was wearing a keffiyeh. She was wearing it in the style of a hijab, and she had brown skin. And I asked her, I said, "Are you Palestinian?" And she said, "No." She said, "I'm Mexican." She said, "But I'm wearing the keffiyeh every day during Lent as a spiritual practice in solidarity with the people of Gaza to let them know that I'm praying for them and I'm working to end the genocide that's happening there." Now, NPR said something similar. A man was asked why he wears the keffiyeh, and he said, "It means that I stand in solidarity with all oppressed people, especially with Palestinians. I understand that it means a lot of different things to different people, but for me, it's showing that I see them and that I am there for them." And so this article in Christianity Today says that when you wear a keffiyeh, you're supporting terrorism. And I just think that is such a narrow-minded way of thinking. And it is such an erasure of Palestinian culture and identity. Not only that, he said it is an obscenity to wear. To put the keffiyeh around the child of Christ is an obscenity. And so to say it's an obscenity, to show Christ empathizing with the people that right now are being massacred, and not only are they being massacred in Gaza, Palestinians have been living under decades of occupation, and it's being ignored by the most powerful nations in the world. And to ignore that, to me, is to ignore the very heart of the message of the gospel of Jesus. Christ came into the world to show love to the lost, to the oppressed, and to the suffering. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believed in him would not perish. He came for the least of these. I won't take more time here to parse the rest of the article and how grossly damaging it is, except to say stop. Stop calling Christians to elevate Jews over Palestinians, or Palestinians over Jews. Stop perpetuating false binaries. Stop spewing hatred instead of love. Jesus loved Jewish people, all kinds of Jewish people, even those the most rejected by the society of the day. And Jesus, similarly today, would suffer alongside all who are brokenhearted. Jewish Israelis devastated by October 7th, Palestinians all over the world, especially in Gaza. Jesus would say, enough of this war, enough of this genocide, enough anti-Semitism, enough hatred. Might we love and not hate.